have a utility pole so close that if somebody is now illegally reaching for their cell phone or whatever, they crash into a pole and get killed or seriously hurt. There are other areas, KSB, the Land Reform Act, where previously Bishop Estate was able to control land ownership, to hold the land, lease it out, long-term leases, 55-year leases, with renewal periods at about every 15 or 20 years. And it finally came to the point where the increases were huge. And so Hawaii passed a Land Reform Act that enabled people in a subdivision to get together, and if they had enough of the owners, they could petition to have the land under their homes condemned and have a jury determine the value, and then they would pay that value and get the land under their homes. And they did a few of the trials and kind of got an idea of what the values were, and so at that point they started negotiating and selling it. And that's mostly what they're doing now. You almost never see a leasehold conversion lawsuit go to trial anymore. What will be interesting though is the same principle is on the rail, because they're going to have to condemn the land around the rail path and these stations. And if the people don't agree to the values that they're offering to pay, then they're going to have to do a jury trial to determine that value. And that's going to take a while. So those are just examples of some areas. Another one is Bill Richardson, the former Chief Justice of the Hawaii Supreme Court, authored an opinion in which it basically changed the ownership of the portion of the beaches between the vegetation high water mark and the ocean to be public land, state land, and it required public access every certain amount of distance. Previous to that, it was privately owned. If they wanted to put in things to make the sand accrete and build up in their area or whatever, they could do that. And you see that, the effects of that very strongly in Kailua, Lanikai, places like that. We used to rent in Lanikai, and the place where we used to rent has no more beach anymore because the seawalls and the stuff that the guys put in along the way, including one guy who used to be the Department of Transportation chairman, did it while he worked for the state, has really affected the beach erosion and the beach contours. So it's an area where the policy can come in under tort principles, not contract principles, and change the policy of the state. You see it a lot in insurance cases. For example, in Hawaii, if somebody from another state is here and rents a car and they cause an accident and they kill or injure somebody seriously and they have an insurance policy in their state, that insurance policy is going to get interpreted according to Hawaii law, because Hawaii has ruled and the federal court here has ruled and the Ninth Circuit federal court in San Francisco has ruled that in auto accident insurance cases, Hawaii insurance law governs, not the law of the insurance policy where in the state where the policy was issued or purchased. That has struck insurance companies and people who buy insurance policies in other states as kind of strange, because they say, it's not what we bought, that's not what we contracted for. Well, the insurance policy says it covers you in any state that you have an accident, and so the laws of that state are going to apply. And Hawaii applies them pretty strongly. So I've had cases where insurance policies that said, we only have $100,000 coverage, but we cover 5 vehicles. And the Hawaii judges said, no, you have $500,000 coverage, $100,000 for each vehicle. And, those are all things to pay attention to as a product of torts law. Tort law is basically distinguished from criminal law. It has nothing to do, it's one of the civil areas. And family law has nothing to do with that, it's a civil area. The other area of civil law is contract law. There is also administrative law, which you probably won't get into and won't get buried with. And it's very arcane and very complex and very intricate. Some of us would say extremely boring, but those who do administrative law and do it well, it's its own area. Immigration law is an example. Licensing law, license law, stuff like that. That's an example. But the difference between tort law and contract law, do you have any sense of what that is? Out of the blue? Contract law comes from what? I mean, if you're looking to figure out what the law is in a contract case, what's the first thing you look at? The contract. Okay, good. So there's something that says, these are the rights and the duties of the parties, and if somebody breaches their duty, this is what happens. These are the responsibilities. And as long as the contract complies with the law, then that can be enforced that way. If it doesn't, then the law is going to substitute whatever the common law is for that contract law that doesn't comply with it. So you need to watch out for that a little bit. Torts are all common law, which means the court makes the law. And some of it's statutory, and some of it is actually made by the courts in cases. And the legislature can formulate tort law. So for example, they can say that the state can be sued the same way any individual could, except for those things that the state does not agree to be sued for. And the states originally had what was called sovereign immunity, like the king in the old days. And you would think in a country that got rid of the kings that we wouldn't keep that, but we did. And so there are cases where the state does not have the same liability as a private party because they have not agreed to give up that sovereign immunity protection in some specific area. For example, if you've got a four-car collision and they all bang each other and they're all, drivers 2, 3, and 4 are all negligent, they're all partly at fault, the guy who gets hit in the first car can collect from any one of them, or he can collect from all of them. Joint and several liability in tort cases mean that anybody that's at fault can be liable for the full amount, even if their proportion is small. For the state, there's an exception. They got the legislature to pass a statute that says, no, you can only hold the state responsible for its percentage share of liability. There are some exceptions to that. Highway design cases. If there is a defect and the state has notice of the defect in a highway design or construction case, the state can be held liable for the full amount, joint and several, just like any private company. When I was in my first semester in law school, one of the first things that the contract teacher said, the law enforces legal obligations and contractual obligations. It does not enforce moral obligations. And being a 60s guy, that was really disappointing to me. And so, before I got up and walked out, I said, okay, if it doesn't enforce moral obligations, what do you mean? What kind of obligations does it enforce? I said, well, contracts that comply with the law, contractual obligations are enforced. And there is also tort law, which is policy made by the state through its courts, sometimes through the federal courts, but usually through the state courts, that determines what the duties of parties are, what the responsibilities and the remedies for breaches of duty are. So, for example, one of the duties in tort law is, any ideas? In tort law, what is the basic duty of a citizen who's driving a car or operating some premises or something like that? Any idea? Reasonable care? Mean anything? Okay. Everybody has a duty of reasonable care, due care. What does that mean? So if TJ is like super careful, does that set the standard for all of us? No. Reasonable care is the care that a reasonably prudent person would have exercised under similar circumstances. And that sounds pretty good, right? Because if you're out in your car and somebody crashes into you and they were not exercising the care of a reasonably prudent person, you want them to be legally responsible. Their insurance company doesn't, but you do. And your insurance company does. And because you outvote them, then no. Because the law puts that responsibility on them. But think about that. If you are legally liable any time that you do not exercise the care that a